And hello, audience. I salute you all with respect from the Life Support Center. It's a pleasure for us to host you in this webinar. We experience the pride of having the absolute giants of critical care nephrology with us today. We are dying to hear their thoughts about the very last consensus statement on pediatric ADQI, which has recently appeared on JAMA Network. First of all, I would like to introduce Marlies Osterman as a doyen of ADQI meetings. She is currently employed in Guy's Foundation and King's College London. You're already aware, but she is such an amazing scholar that it is a true privilege for us to have her here today. It's your round, Marlies. Will you please tell us the impact of ADQI meetings?
Yes, thank you. It's a great honor for me to join this meeting, and I would like to thank you for this kind invitation and your introduction. It really is a great honor. I have learned so much from working with pediatric colleagues, but I'm in great debt and feel very honored to share this meeting. So in the next 15 minutes, I will inform the audience about ADQI and the impact. So the ADQI was founded in 2000, and at that time, ADQI stood for Acute Dialysis Quality Initiative. It was founded in 2000, I'll tell you more about it. And essentially, it's a non-profit international organization with membership from many different disciplines and specialties. And it's not linked to any societies or institutions. It's run by its members. And it has members from many different places across the world and members from different specialties. The majority are nephrologists or clinicians working in the ICU, but there are also members from other specialties. And here we have 3 of the 4 founding members of ADQI. We have Professor Ronco, Professor Kellum, and Professor Mehta, who got together in 2000 and founded ADQI. Professor Belomo is missing on this photo. And they got together really to shape critical care nephrology as a specialty. Their first meeting was held in New York. And when they got together, they had this vision that critical care nephrology could emerge as a specialty with its own focus and advances. At the same time, they were supported by commercial companies that were developing new machines. And they realized there was still quite a lot of, there was a lack of knowledge and there were gaps in knowledge. But at the same time, it was very exciting because there were so many potential opportunities. And so they founded ADQI, so Acute Dialysis Quality Initiative, to provide an objective distillation of the existing literature and to describe the current state of practice at the time. And they felt it was important to develop a consensus of opinion, ideally based on evidence, but also supported by expertise and clinical knowledge by experts in the field. And finally, they thought it was so important to identify priorities for future research. So initially it was called Acute Dialysis Quality Initiative, but the name was later rebranded as the Acute Disease Quality Initiative, and that's what we call it now. So here we have a picture of the first meeting, and the topic of the first meeting was continuous renal replacement therapy. The founding members, the 3 here are included, and Professor Belomo, gathered a team of experts, and they summarized the existing literature on CRRT, which at the time wasn't that rich. But they summarized everything as well as possible and complemented it with their expertise and their vision for the future. And this was summarized in a landmark paper published in KI. And this is truly a landmark paper, which was cited more than 250 times since then. But this paper also led to major studies in research, for instance, the ATN trial and the renal trial in Australia. One of the outcomes was the BEST kidney study, which is an observational study. It was developed at this meeting in New York, and subsequently really informed the audience about clinical practice worldwide. They have data from more than 20 countries, and the paper was published in JAMA. At the same time, critical care nephrology was emerging, but it became clear that there were so many gaps in understanding and gaps in knowledge. And this was not helped by the fact that acute kidney injury, at that time it was called acute renal failure, wasn't really defined. In fact, there were more than 50 different definitions of acute renal failure in existence. And therefore, the epidemiology of acute renal failure was unclear. So the second meeting focused on defining acute renal failure. At the meeting held in Vicenza, the team felt that maybe acute renal failure wasn't the right term any longer, wasn't appropriate, and it was replaced with acute kidney injury. So the second ADQI meeting was the birth of acute kidney injury. And it was also the meeting where the first consensus definition for acute kidney injury was developed. It was the Rifle classification as it stands here. It's now 20 years old, but it was the first ever consensus definition of acute kidney injury. It has been subsequently been refined. We had the ADQI network classification, and then in 2012, the KDIGO consensus definition, but they're all really based on the original Rifle and later ADQI classification. And not surprisingly, the outcome of this paper, of this meeting, was published, and this is a highly cited paper with more than 7,000 citations. These first two meetings were followed by now another 26 meetings. And as you can see, these meetings focus on different aspects of critical care nephrology. They reached out to other specialties. So we had joint meetings with vascular surgeons, with pulmonologists. They touched on clinical topics, but also related topics like quality improvement, for instance, or big data. And all these meetings were really held and conducted by experts from across the world. And in all these meetings, there was always representation from pediatrics, because it was clear that we could all learn from each other. And one of the highlights was certainly the pediatric ADQI meeting in 2021. The meetings follow the same style. The meetings follow a modified Delphi process, where a topic of interest, a topic with gaps in knowledge is identified by some key leaders, who then gather a committee. And then the conferences consist of panel meetings and breakout sessions. Here we have a photo of one of these panel sessions. And then in breakout sessions, smaller groups get together and try to address a key question for clinical practice or research. Ideally, these questions should be answered based on the existing data, but there's so many areas where data does not exist. And so often group members and groups are tasked to develop new concepts or to develop models for future research, future thinking. Here we have a picture of one of these group sessions where the team was trying to develop a new concept related to an area in clinical practice. Sometimes it's difficult to find the answers. Sometimes there are disagreements. There's each group meeting, breakout session is followed by a presentation to the whole panel and seeking feedback. And then it is followed again by further breakout sessions to act on the feedback as delivered. And then people go back to their groups and act on the feedback. The meetings are held in different places with different people seeking individual expertise and knowledge. And the highlight now in the last 20 years has been really a large number of publications and the development of many different concepts. Just as an example, this 2x2 table showing the concept of biomarkers, which was developed in Ireland in 2011, has been shown at hundreds of meetings across the world, and it's still routinely used when we talk about biomarkers. Cardiorenal syndrome was a topic of one of the ADQI meetings, and this was a meeting where the different types of cardiorenal syndrome were identified and described, and they still exist. And certainly this was followed by a Society of Cardiorenal Syndrome and a dedicated journal driven really by the output of this meeting. And as I've always said, some ADQI meetings go beyond clinical practice and research and address areas that are often neglected or have not been investigated thoroughly. And one of these areas, for instance, was quality improvement and quality improvement parameters. And this was identified as an area of importance by Professor Kashani from the Mayo Clinic and colleagues. And they held a meeting to summarize the existing knowledge, importantly, the lack of knowledge and lack of data, and developed models for future quality improvement projects, defined some general concepts, and suggested quality improvement parameters, as seen here on your right. So an important aspect of ADQI meetings is to develop recommendations for clinical practice. And we have numerous papers now giving us recommendations for clinical practice. The most recent one is obviously the outcome of the pediatric ADQI meeting, really a highlight of the ADQI series. And then a second aim is to develop and identify research priorities. Just as an example, a meeting was held in Austria, led by Professor Ioannidis. And here we have a large number of potential future projects, which all warrant research in future. And identifying these research priorities helps researchers and helps the whole field, because it will also support grant applications and it will foster collaborations between researchers. So looking back now in the last 22 years, there have been numerous high impact publications. I'll just show you a few here who are randomly selected. The most recent one is clearly the pediatric one, a very important paper published in JAMA, and Stuart Goldstein will talk about it in more detail. There have been webinars, there have been books summarizing the outcomes. And then as an important development, I would like to summarize briefly the outcome of this paper, of this project here by Professor Kellum, where he, after 20 years of ADQI, looked at the impact of these meetings. And he compared the ADQI publications with randomized controlled trials in the same fields. So here on your left, you have the different ADQI papers, the products of these various meetings. And in 2020, these papers were cited, as you can see, some papers were cited more than 100 times. Certainly the original rifle paper was at that time cited more than 6,000 times. It's now cited more than 7,500 times. And in the same years, papers were published describing the outcomes of clinical trials, randomized controlled trials. Now, when you compare the citations, you'll clearly see they're very, very similar. And so Professor Kellum concluded that ADQI reports received a similar number of citations compared to high-level randomized controlled trials, but they were often published in papers with the lower impact factor. But on the plus side, these highly cited papers were produced in meetings where the cost of these meetings was significantly lower than the cost of conducting clinical trials. Coming to the end of this presentation, I'd also like to point out the important impact on individuals. So these meetings always serve to foster collaborations. There have been meetings between different groups, different specialties, sometimes joint meetings with other medical societies. And overall, they have led to the development of a nice network and the development of new friends. The meetings have been held in various important places, some of them temples of science and education, like Cambridge, for instance, here. Lastly, COVID did not stop the ADQI meetings. When it was necessary to have virtual meetings, a successful meeting was held in 2019 with a large impact publication. And as I've already said, a lot of collaborations have been developed, friendships have been fostered, because these meetings are obviously accompanied by social events, and there's often also some general education, as shown here. In 2020, ADQI celebrated its 20th birthday, and here we have the founders of the ADQI meeting. And so here's my final slide, where I want to acknowledge the huge impact of the founders on the development of critical care nephrology, because I strongly believe that ADQI has contributed to the advances in critical care nephrology by supporting clinical practice and research, by bringing people together and establishing friends. And only through ADQI did I get in contact with pediatric nephrologists, and I've learned so much from pediatric colleagues. Thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you very much for this talk. We can get the questions from the audience. You can just raise your hands or write it down. Let's wait for a while. Okay, now we are going to move on with the second talk. And now I am so excited to introduce you Stuart Goldstein from Cincinnati Children's Hospital. He's also a doyen of ADQI meetings and a wise man on ADQI. We truly appreciate his addings to critical care science. He successfully shared the leadership for the very first pediatric ADQI. Now it's your turn to please enlighten us about pADQI. We can't hear you, Stu. Microphone is blocked.
Great, sorry about that.
Okay, now we can hear you.
Great. Want to thank the group with Benon here, as well as Dr. Osterman and Dr. Neumeier. So it's really a pleasure to discuss the pediatric ADQI. And in full disclosure, I'm stealing all of Dr. Aisha Arakan's slides as she presented the pediatric ADQI just a couple of weeks ago at the 4th International Symposium on AKI in children. But on either more full disclosure, Aisha shamelessly stole most of this presentation from Raj and myself. And now I am stealing it back from her. And this is a evidence of collaboration that we have in pediatric acute care nephrology, share seamlessly and steal shamelessly. And neither of us are even remotely sorry that we have pilfered each other's slides. I have no disclosures or conflicts of interest relevant to this presentation, but I do receive research funding from these entities. And what is important to note, as Dr. Osterman did, is that industry is really responsible for funding all of the ADQIs, and they are allowed to be in the room and hear the discussions, but not to contribute, or there are no booths, there are no sales, and if they could be asked a particular question, because often they have some insights into the use of devices, but they're there just to listen, and we could not do it without the support of our industry partners. So Dr. Osterman spoke about the goal and mission of ADQI, and it has not changed over the 22 years now since its inception. In the past, there were concerns about quality of care delivered to patients with AKI based on evidence and the understanding about high mortality in association with AKI and wide practice variation in diagnosis and management. So this is an evidence-based methodology to develop consensus-based recommendations for managing patients with AKI around all of the areas that Marlies discussed. These are not guideline writing committees like you would see with KDIGO or other international guidelines. This is really to get expert understanding of the current state of practice, but the important parts are really to develop the research agenda that moves the field forward. It's a series of conferences and, again, an evidence-based appraisal and set of consensus recommendations to standardize care, but more importantly, direct further research. And all of the results are available online at the ADQI website. Everything is in the public domain. And as a not-for-profit, all of the figures that you'll see are available for anyone to download. They are not, the ownership is not with the journal in which they are published. And we feel very much that this is a global community and everyone should have easy and free available access. Marlies has gone through all of this as well, and we were not deterred by the pandemic, although we originally were going to be ADQI 25, but then the pandemic had other thoughts for us. And I felt, having been part of, as a pediatrician of numerous ADQIs, that it would be more important for us to meet in person for those of us who could, in order to really generate the fruitful discussions and back and forth that are really a hallmark of the ADQI process. The ADQI, the AKI and COVID ADQI was done virtually, and many of the people there were veterans of ADQI and understood the process. And many of the pediatricians at the pediatric ADQI, this was their first experience, and I really wanted them to have that experience. So this was held at the Silverado Resort in Napa Valley last November, and was funded by numerous industry partners, as well as Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, Texas Children's Hospital, and Cincinnati Children's Hospital, where the co-chairs come from. We had nearly worldwide representation in terms of continents. We did not have anybody able to make it from Australia, but there were a couple of other really important novel aspects of this ADQI. We strove for absolute equity in terms of gender identity. We had 23 women and 23 men as part of the ADQI process. The average age was 46, which is younger probably than any ADQI other than probably the first one with Doctors Belomo, Mehta, Kellum, and Ronco. We had the first ever patient representative, a patient who survived acute kidney injury and CRT from the age of 7. She is now 27 years old and came and opened the ADQI, and an advocacy expert, an expert in health services, research, and social determinants of health. So once again, pediatrics leading the way in these concepts. Here it's the entire group, and I really must give acknowledgement to Professor Osterman. Even though not a pediatrician, she appeared not in person, but live from London when it was often very late at night for her. And she really represented the ADQI board incredibly well. And not only listened, but contributed to our discussions, because we were in a unique situation where we wanted this ADQI to be pediatric focused, but there's clearly a rich history and library of publications from previous ADQIs that we wanted to integrate where it made sense, and not just be repetitive, but and her insights there really improved the outcome. So I was privileged to chair this with Raj Basu, pediatric intensivist, and Dr. Aisha Arakan, pediatric intensivist and nephrologist, and the first such dual board certified individual in the United States. And it was really a pleasure. So we asked a number of questions. Let's get to the meat of this. What are the opportunities for understanding the epidemiology of acute kidney injury in children? How can old and new techniques be integrated to inform precision medicine and innovation in children with acute kidney injury? Is there a best way to adjudicate and manage fluid overload? And of course, this was a topic of ADQI fluid management in London. I think it was ADQI 12, and actually that's where I first met Dr. Osterman in London. But I think everyone will agree that the association between fluid overload or fluid accumulation and poor outcomes in children with acute kidney injury was discovered or reported first in children. And this is an area where we really informed some adult medicine. How can the pathobiology of AKI be translated at the bedside? And this is really a new area for ADQI, and was quite ambitious because this group, as I'll show you, had many different aspects to tackle. And then what needs to be understood in order to feed our kids with AKI, give them medicine, use other adjunctive therapy. And finally, an educational work group. What is the best way to educate patients, families, and learners about AKI? And this builds upon the quality improvement ADQI, but again, was an area that was quite novel for the ADQI group and had not really been tackled in all of the previous adult-focused ADQIs. So the process, Marlies has gone through this with you, so I'm not going to reiterate it, but we came out with 6 groups and we prepare our topics ahead of the meeting, multiple web-based meetings over about 1.5 years to come to this intense 1.5 day meeting in person. We defined the questions that needed to be addressed, and the first day is all about refining those questions. All of the groups thought they had their work done, before they came to the meeting, and they quickly learned in the ADQI process that there is much that needs to be refined at the meeting. We modify our presentations, and then everyone went home. We had 2 virtual meetings to wrap up the consensus formation. Everybody has the same vote. There is no one person's vote that is more important than the others, and we come up with a consensus at the end. So Dr. Ericon Basu and I were the local leaders, and Drs. Ronco, Mehta, and Osterman were the ADQI board members, and they certainly had a lot of input. In the epidemiology group, Mike Zappatelli and Scott Sutherland led that group. In the diagnosis, precision diagnosis group, Catherine Krzyzewski and Dana Furman led that group with Jason Greenberg, Katja Gist, and Natalia Stansky. The fluid group led by David Saluski and Sean Bagshaw. And I do have to mention Sean. Sean is obviously an adult intensivist, but he has been incredibly supportive about moving pediatric nephrologists and intensivists and their research forward. And he is actually the person who spurred the concept that it was time to have a pediatric ADQI. So his participation was certainly warranted and merited. The RINSER group, or really the continuous kidney replacement therapy group, was led by David Ashkenazi and Tara Naumeyer, and she'll be speaking about that group. This group, again, was the pathobiology, nutrition, and pharmacology group, and Jen Charlton and Pat Brophy led that group. Again, a very diverse group with a dietitian in Molly Vega and Aaron Barreto, who's a pharmacist. And then the educational group led by Jordan Simmons and Teresa Mattis. As well, I have to mention Andrea Conroy, who is located in Uganda, and she traveled to Napa for this meeting because we really also wanted to understand that more than 80% of kids with acute kidney injury are not in areas where there's tertiary or quaternary institutions within a 50-mile radius, and trying to understand how we can develop these concepts and make them applicable in those lower resource settings was a mission for us. And then Ray Bignell, an expert in health services research and diversity, equity, inclusion, and social determinants of health. And as I mentioned, Leslie Meigs, a survivor of acute kidney injury. This was a SMART meeting. It was a hybrid meeting. So even though about 2/3 of us could meet in person, we certainly made sure that other members were actively engaged in their own time zones by a virtual platform. And this actually worked quite seamlessly, and I think was quite important for the success of what we were doing. Here is the group with, importantly, our patient representative, Leslie Meigs, out front, and we were fortunate to have some beautiful times weather in Northern California. The meeting continued afterwards, as I've said, and there was near uniform and complete representation at these 2 final meetings. We also have fun in the ways that adults just don't know how to. So we had a bingo game that was going on. So there was a pediatric ADQI bingo. And as noted, we are really proud. This was a milestone for pediatric acute care nephrology. This consensus statement was published in JAMA Network Open just a few weeks ago. And again, we wanted to have the publication open access to everybody in the world so that they could apply their, they could have access to it and see what was relevant to them. So let's just go to the key points. We have our questions, we had the findings, and then we looked at what the meanings were for moving the field forward. So in the EPI group, they stratified the consensus. There's a stratified understanding of high-risk populations, neonates, patients with heart disease, chronic disease, sepsis, cystic fibrosis, etc. And the knowledge gap and needed work are in middle and low income populations and expanded AKI phenotypes. And this has already generated a discussion with Jorge Cerda and others about having an ADQI specifically devoted to AKI and treatment in low and middle income countries with lower resources. And so we're working on developing that ADQI in the future. In terms of precision diagnosis, there was a consensus on biomarker-based delineation and of standard versus high risk that comes from the ADQI in Dublin, as well as the ADQI that Dr. Osterman led in Padua a few years ago. And there are pediatric specific data that can help guide us in using biomarkers to delineate functional versus structural AKI. The knowledge gap and needed work is to integrate that into current diagnostics and to look at differentiation of these diagnostics over time. And no one has really looked at that yet. The fluid group, this was really critical, and I will tell you that I am one of the people who developed the term fluid overload to represent all degrees of fluid accumulation. And what this group said was, no, that's wrong, that we need to think of the term fluid balance and define an anchor weight, which is the ICU admission weight for most studies to determine the degree of fluid accumulation. And then the knowledge gap is where does fluid accumulation come into fluid overload by illness state? When is accumulation leading to a physiological change that's detrimental to the patient and their health? And I think that this will be one of the principal defining moments for all of ADQI and moving forward using these terms systematically and in a standardized fashion. The Rinser group, I'm not going to go through because Dr. Neumeier is going to discuss this, but this really had to tackle acute renal replacement therapy and other extracorporeal therapies across the entire spectrum of pediatric age and weight. And then second to last, this very diverse group that pediatrics incorporated into research efforts, again, discussing the lack of pediatric data, importance of nephrotoxin stewardship programs, promoting bench to bedside collaborations between preclinical, epidemiological and clinical trial researchers. And this is just a fantastic overview in the current publication. And some really important work that is coming out of basic science, and namely some of the researchers of this group, determination of sex as a biological variable related to AKI, characterize medications affected by AKI across the developmental spectrum, and then the identification of the optimal nutritional interventions by age for AKI. And then finally, differential approach in the educational sphere based on national resources, integration of electronic medical records and checklists should be available to everybody, and there is consensus about this. The knowledge gap that we need to work on is the partnership between governments and community and cross-discipline healthcare training. So these are always called the killer figures and these are available to you now on the ADQI website. There are many more figures that will be coming down, but these are available with the current publication and the supplement. And I think Marlies and Dr. Kellum has said that these figures blow away any other previous ADQI figures. Pediatricians are really good at this. So I hope that you'll look at them. So here's the summary. Again, this is in tabular form, so you can have it. And I know this is being recorded, so I wanted everybody to be able to also look at this in tabular form instead of just a work group by work group form. What I will also say is that we have 7 planned supplemental publications from each work group. There will be 2 publications from work group 5, and we have a tacit agreement from pediatric nephrology, which is the publication of the International Pediatric Nephrology Association, and these will also be available as open access. We're working on editing those publications now, and we're hopeful to have them submitted as one group of publications to pediatric nephrology early in the next year. So very excited about that. This will be a very deep dive into each of these work groups. We too have a lot of fun, and it's easy to do so if you like wine in Napa Valley. And again, very intense meetings, and you can see a vote over a certain question that Scott Sutherland was posing, and very integrated group. So if you have Twitter, please follow ADQI at @P_ADQI. It's a way to see what's going on in critical care nephrology in pediatrics, and really it's a pleasure and an honor to represent the entire pediatric ADQI work group. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Okay, thank you very much too. Actually, thanks for the speech and exceeding the time because we are pleased with the extended talk. Thank you very much. I can give some numbers. We have almost 15 audience from Turkey, Arabia, Italy, Spain, England, and United States, representing the United Nations. I see that Ayşe Erikan has arrived. Ayşe was the other co-chair of the pADQI. Ayşe, Stu confessed that his presentation was stolen from you. Would you like to add some? Can you hear me? Ayşe? Okay. We will put this in Life Support Center site as a podcast, so everybody will see your confessions too. Now the last scholar is Tara Neumeyer, and she's an emerging star, I believe. I had the chance to see the wisdom on her as a participant in the research group of pADQI. For the ones who want to follow her, she is from Washington University, St. Louis. She is also an expert on tandem extracorporeal applications. She's going to give the clues for rinsing. You're on, Tara. You're welcome, please.
Thank you so much, Benan. I'll see if I can share my screen here so we've got it ready to go. All right. Are we seeing it in the presentation form? Yes, okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's such a pleasure to see Benan. He was part of our rinsers group, and we were super lucky to have him. I am here just as a representative of this amazing group of people. As you can see, along the bottom here, we had 6 members of our group, including people from Canada, from the US, from Turkey, from London. We had nurses, doctors. We really had a great group of people, and we were really excited to be part of ADQI for the first pediatric ADQI. For disclosures, there are none for myself or for the group that directly affect this talk. As you can see, a couple of members of our group do have some relationships with industry. And this is really the question that our group came down to. Excuse me. I have a 4-year-old, she gives me illnesses. So, this was a process of telescoping. We started off with about 3 broad questions, expanded that to over, to dozens of questions. I think in the end, we ended up with more than 70, very specific questions about kidney support therapy in children. And then in the process of the ADQI meeting, had to really bring that back down to one core question. This is the question that we came up with, which was, how can use of kidney support and extracorporeal therapies be advanced and made specific in children? And this was the group figure that we came up with to really summarize our ideas about what we wanted to set forward as the priorities for kidney support therapy in children. And I'll take you through this, but I want you to think of this as a roadmap about what are some of the areas that we can really press on to advance the field, and then remembering to keep patients and patient outcomes in the center of that process. And as you can see here, we had 4 main domains. One of them was about really building a PAKST program. The next one was about actual technical delivery of kidney support therapy. And then thinking about how do we transition off of acute kidney support therapy, either in a full recovery phase or in a transitional phase when people are still recovering or may have ongoing dialysis dependence. And then finally, what's that role of kidney support therapy in non-kidney diseases where you're not specifically trying to treat acute kidney injury or fluid overload, but you're trying to treat some of these more systemic or other organ illnesses that can be impacted by kidney support therapy. So in the process of our group's work, we managed to come up with several consensus statements that really address those different areas that I just touched on. And we really wanted to focus on that program building piece and make that something that was adaptable to all kinds of different settings, so to state principles and not necessarily think about details. And so what we came up with was that a great kidney support therapy program really needs a dedicated multidisciplinary team that is going to include kidney healthcare workers, that's nurses, physicians, social workers, dietitians, the whole gamut. And that it should really engage patients and families and requires institutional investments in personnel, in time, in materials, and in quality assurance and improvement systems. And so you can see that represented here, where I really think about sort of this being a resources issue, a culture of safety issue. So that safety being about transparency, standardization, really thinking about how to bring everybody onto the same page and make sure that things are functioning optimally. Maintaining and obtaining great equipment and supplies, and then having a QI data and analysis system so that you can measure and analyze what you do as a team and find the points where your team can improve. Within that resources tab, I really wanted to focus on thinking about how you can identify medical and nursing leaders for your kidney support therapy program. And then again, engage that multidisciplinary team, and then not forgetting the importance of time. It really is, to do this well takes a lot of time, and that is its own form of investment, and the institution needs to recognize that as well. Your kidney support therapy program, your acute kidney support therapy program may fit nicely into your chronic kidney support therapy program, or it may need to be quite separate. And that's something that institution by institution needs to be determined and addressed and implemented. So thinking about this as a very flexible framework, but having sorts of these essential sort of scaffolding components to really make the system work. There's a limited amount of data for any of this to think about how to do that well. This is a paper that came out of a group in Kentucky, and they were just going through a modified Delphi process for themselves. And they really felt like the important features were to assemble a multidisciplinary team. For them, that included nephrologists, intensivists, ICU nurses, pharmacists, dietitians, physical therapists. You need technicians, you need bioinformaticians, you need people who can really pull together data, keep everything maintained, and really work together as a team. And they included in this system the supply chain, which is obviously an important aspect of obtaining equipment and being able to maintain it over time. They next focused on standardization of their CRT protocol, and they really wanted to emphasize tailoring that to your institutional logistics and needs, which again was something that we had thought was really important. And then I wanted to highlight that they went through a particular and a thoughtful selection, monitoring, and reporting of the QI metrics that they thought were important for their program. And so thinking about how you can do that for your program, maybe even starting small and then building, can really be an important way to start thinking about quality improvement in your system. Stuart's telling me I need to go to slideshow, so I'm going to go from right there. That's probably much better. All right, fantastic. All right, so within this group, we really felt like there were a couple of things that we wanted to focus on for the future directions in program building. And one of those was about program structures. So what are some of the things that really help your program work best? And again, making sure that that's flexible, but also, you know, has a specific scaffolding that everybody can sort of anchor to. What are the best formal training programs and educational approaches that you can use to onboard new members, maintain competency in your team members, and then provide skill growth and dissemination of new information as processes and practice change? Can we build some resource and needs assessment tools that then help us identify those pieces of our program that we need to work on and to improve? And can we build communication aids that help us really communicate within our own team and among the teams that we have to interface with, whether that's the chronic kidney disease team, whether that's the broader ICU team or broader consultant teams and surgical teams? How can we really optimize the communication around delivery of PAKST in our programs? Our second statement really addressed that concept of delivering PAKST. So really talks about the optimal delivery of PAKST, including timely and safe initiation, appropriate access, both placement and maintenance. Looking at clearance dose, which has not been a huge focus in pediatric literature. Looking at reliable anticoagulation protocols, choosing appropriate modalities, specifically if you're choosing among sort of peritoneal dialysis, CRRT, intermittent hemodialysis, how do you sort of put all of that together? And then thinking about appropriate medication and nutrient adjustments and dynamic prescriptions of fluid removal rate. And you can see from this topic how our work overlapped with the work of the other 5 groups, which was just an amazing experience to really build on what they were doing as well. So this is an adult paper again, and this was thinking about identifying and prioritizing quality indicators. And you can see here that they were talking about things like filter life, therapy prescription, making sure that that was patient-centered. That was something that we also really emphasized. Thinking about medication adjustments, and then thinking about delivered dose. So, we know that there's a difference, there's a gap between prescribed dose and delivered dose, and how do you monitor that delivered dose and ensure that you're really delivering what you think you are? And then thinking a bit about fluid management. And I really encourage you to look through the fluid management paper, the subpaper that will come out of the pADQI, and also just the main paper, because this notion of individualizing fluid management based on disease state and thinking about that as a really dynamic process, I think is really important when you're approaching mechanical fluid removal, where you are actually controlling those pieces more directly. And so we really thought that was a really interesting and important part of good PAKST delivery. And then again, that notion of downtime, that gap between delivered dose and prescribed dose. So this, there's a wide open field here for future directions, but really one of the sort of thorniest problems continues to be this idea about thresholds of PAKST initiation. And there's been a lot of work done on sort of clinical, functional, and biochemical thresholds without really a definitive answer, even within the adult literature. And we really wanted to point out that there has yet to be a fluid overload or fluid balance threshold for PAKST initiation. There's not been a great study of that to date at this point. And then thinking about those treatment delivery benchmarks. So how do we think about optimal circuit priming? Is blood priming necessary for all the patients that we currently think it's necessary for? What about those kids who are going to be up for sort of solid organ transplant, and you're risking sort of inducing allogenic induction in those patients? And then how do we think about that delivered dose, fluid management, circuit life, and anticoagulation piece? We thought a lot about access optimization practices. I think this is a particularly challenging issue in pediatrics, where you have such small patients and you need these large bore catheters in order to make the system function. Catheter malfunctions have been well described as being among the most frequent reasons that we have losses of circuits and downtime with circuits. And so how can we reduce catheter malfunction so we can deliver the dose that we really think we want to? And then how can we eliminate catheter-related bloodstream infections and catheter-related thrombosis and stenosis events? There is some adult literature out there about trying to match catheter size to vessel diameter and trying to institute really more uniform surveillance programs. There's a very recent article, not in dialysis catheters, but in CVLs, about using enoxaparin as a preventive agent for thrombosis in post-op congenital heart disease kids. But none of that really addresses a catheter that has fairly continuous flow going through it and has its own anticoagulation associated. So how do we think about that in the PAKST program? That's a really open question, but an important one. And then finally, we wanted to think about adverse events and outcomes that are particular to pediatric acute kidney support therapy. So thinking about that hemodynamic instability at circuit initiation for those really tenuous, fragile kids, thinking about those transfusion requirements. We know a lot of kids develop thrombocytopenia. So, what are the platelet requirements? What happens when you transfuse platelets into those kids? And thinking really precisely about those nutrition and growth pieces. There isn't really even much adult data about optimizing nutrition on CRRT. We know that there is protein loss within the circuit, but there's also likely to be a lot of micronutrient loss as well. And for children whose nutritional needs are quite different from grownups and who also have growth needs, we thought that this was a really, really important piece of what we don't know yet about CRRT. This next piece is really about that transition off of CRRT. So thinking about those patient-centered goals of care that can really influence that timing of coming off of CRRT. We're also thinking about degree of kidney recovery, the physiological stability of the patient, the fluid balance that you've achieved, and then sort of global recovery and rehabilitation priorities. And these inform your decisions for de-escalation, liberation, transition, and follow-up, with the goal of optimizing hospital-based and lifelong outcomes. Again, had to go to the adult literature to find anything about this whatsoever. There have been a few scattered papers that tried to address this question. This was a systematic review and meta-analysis that attempted to really pool together the data on liberation and transition. They were able to identify 16 variables from 23 different studies. However, the heterogeneity among those studies in terms of thresholds and the granularity of the data really precluded a meta-analysis of most of those variables. They were able to do a pooled analysis of urine output as a predictor of successful transition, and they had pretty decent sensitivity and specificity. However, the heterogeneity among those studies still precluded that identification of an optimal threshold, even of urine output. So obviously more urine output when you come off is better, but what exactly is the number or the threshold that indicates that you're likely to succeed in coming off is still unknown, even among adult patients. We've thought about this really in the context of this emerging data on ICU liberation. So this is most commonly addressed within the ABCDEF bundle literature. This really focuses on essentially making sure that patients are adequately controlled in terms of pain and anxiety, but also are having opportunities to be awake and be more mobile to aid a faster recovery. And so you can see the elements of the ABCDEF there. I really just wanted to point out that the that B includes spontaneous awakening and breathing trials. E includes early mobility and exercise, and that really does mean walking a lot of the time. And F is about family engagement and empowerment. And you can see here that implementation of the ABCDEF bundle really impacts meaningful outcomes like time to ICU discharge, hospital discharge, and mortality. So if a pediatric patient is tethered to the bed because they are attached to the CRRT machine, how does that impact their global recovery? We wanted to think about transition off of CRRT within that context and framework as well. So in that context, we wanted to understand in the future directions the impact of timing of de-escalation. We wanted to see, are there any clinical, functional, and/or biochemical markers that can signal de-escalation or transition readiness? That's an open field. Oops, sorry. Are there particular strategies for transition to intermittent or chronic kidney support therapy for those kids who are not quite ready to be completely dialysis free at the time that they are ready to pursue a more aggressive rehabilitation? And then what are the optimal follow-up and monitoring systems, both sort of within their hospital stay, but also after their hospital stay, and even, long after, when we know they're at risk for adverse cardiovascular neurologic outcomes. Finally, we really wanted to address the timely initiation of extracorporeal therapy for non-kidney diseases. This is a very wide open field, and many of the elements in this field are quite experimental and new, and they involve development of new technologies and new systems. But what we really wanted to emphasize within this group is that if you're going to employ extracorporeal therapy for non-kidney diseases, you need to have explicit clinical and/or biological criteria that you're trying to treat, and markers of the treatment being effective. So those objective indicators of response to therapy, and those need to be continuously evaluated throughout your treatment course in order to really optimally deploy those therapies. And you can see here from this little graphic that there are systems under investigation for all kinds of diseases, for neurologic disease, for sepsis and systemic inflammatory disease, for lung disease with CO2 removal, for heart disease, for liver disease. And I think historically the ones that we think about are those liver disease pieces, but this field has really expanded, and this is kind of a wide open field in terms of exploration. So just to sum up, we believe that improving pediatric acute kidney support therapy requires programs and processes that engage all stakeholders, that keep children and families at the center, and that adapt to both environmental and situational needs. We recognize that pediatric specific data is scarce, which we would put forward as an opportunity. And we know that because of the kinds of limitations in terms of patient volume and disease heterogeneity, collaboration will be necessary to get the kind of high quality data we need to answer these questions. And with that, I would just say thank you for your time and for having me, and it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much, Tara. Actually, thank you all very much for spending your very valuable time. A lot of colleagues and students participated in the webinar, and I hope your talks are going to widen their horizon for further kidney research and practice. In pediatrics, we have various age groups, so we will need further ADQIs for each age group. Neonatal ADQI, for example, Marius, what do you think about that? I want to ask the audience, anybody wants to add something or ask something? We are ready for that now. Then thank you. We had exceeded the time very much, but it was my pleasure. It was really good. Thank you very much again.
Dear Bayrakçı, Orkun Baloğlu is asking something about our meeting.
Okay, is that you can ask?
No, Orkun Baloğlu.
Hey everyone. I'm Orkun, one of the pediatric ICU and pediatric cardiac ICU doctors at Cleveland Clinic. On a personal note, I'm an alumni of Hacettepe University, and Dr. Benan was my first mentor. I know he remembers those years, and he inspired me to be a pediatrician and intensivist. So I just want to say thank
Welcome.
you, special thanks. So also I want to thank you organizing this webinar, and also I'd like to thank all the speakers for their all the valuable insight and all the explanation of the pediatric ADQI. So my question is after this. So my current research is on cardiac surgery associated kidney injury, and we are trying to implement machine learning and artificial intelligence algorithms, as well as some applied mathematical modeling on kidney injury, cardiac surgery associated kidney injury. So I will be very curious to hear from all the speakers and all the research leaders in the pediatric ADQI group. What do they think about machine learning and math modeling in the ADQI perspective? So thank you.
I'm happy to take that first, Marlies, if that's okay. So ADQI 27, so the one right after ADQI 26 was held in San Diego, and it was called the Digital Health ADQI. And so I think that absolutely where the community is very much coming together to try to understand how we can use artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other algorithms to improve outcomes for patients with acute kidney injury. You know, there's some very rudimentary forms that we have developed, like Ninja and the Renal Angina Index, which are not certainly high-level machine learning, but real thought leaders like Girish Nakdami and others were at this Digital Health ADQI. So it's been submitted for publication. And so again, once published, and Akianush Kashani and Azra Bahorak, actually the leaders in digital health and acute kidney injury, were the co-chairs. I think you will find that ADQI is very supportive of these concepts, and a lot of it will have to do around terminology. But you will see research recommendations that come from that Digital Health ADQI that I think will help you in your grant submission, because once something gets published by ADQI, then that's citable as a gap that the leaders in this specific space think recommend research into. I don't know, Marlies, you were part of that as well. Maybe you have some other thoughts.
No, you've summarized it beautifully. That's exactly it's exactly as Stuart outlined. And at this moment, I would like to invite people to suggest topics for future ADQIs. So if there is an area which is currently either under researched, or where practice is very heterogeneous, or where we have very little data and need some guidance and need people to get together to share their expertise and have some sort of vision for the future, please do please do send and submit a proposal for a future topic of an ADQI. Absolutely. And that's what happened with the Digital Health ADQI. Professor Kashani had the same thoughts and felt that modeling and artificial intelligence was an area which we would all have to face in future very soon. And he felt it was necessary to come to some consensus recommendations for practice, but also importantly for research. So we're all in this together, and we learn from each other, and we're very, very receptive to suggestions.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I just want to say, as also a pediatric cardiac intensivist and a nephrologist, I think one of the challenges that we have in the current machine learning systems that I've seen used is just about, and this is the key to all things, but it's about variable identification. It's really good at tracking the things we already know, but not that good at tracking the things that slide under the radar. And so particularly in pediatric cardiac ICU patients, if we can just get a handle on that impact of central venous hypertension and diastolic dysfunction, we would make a huge stride forward in the field.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks again, Orkun. Thank you. Anybody else? Then it's time to leave. Thank you very much again. We appreciate your presence, and we will podcast it in our site, so your colleagues, students can again come to the Life Support Center site and see the webinar again. Thank you very much. Goodbye. See you in the next webinar.
Great. Thank you so much.
you.
Thanks for
Bye.
organizing this, Benon. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.